Hi, welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm Alan Tansman, director of the Townsend Center for the Humanities. Today will be the second of two lectures given by our honored guest, Lawrence Weschler, Avenelli Chair in the Humanities, who's standing to my right. He's just told me that he doesn't like being praised in introductions, so he will suffer through some of this. Weschler is a graduate of Cowell College.
You said you crossed it out.
I crossed off the bad parts.
Okay.
At the University of, he's a graduate of Cowell College from UC Santa Cruz, and for over 20 years he was a staff writer at The New Yorker. I'm sure you all know all of this. He has written over a dozen books and countless essays, and is a two-time winner of the George Polk Award for Cultural Reporting and Magazine Reporting. He's also received the Lannan Literary Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award for Criticism. When I introduced Ren, if I may, last week, I said that writing like his requires not only abundant talent, but also deep concentration, a free imagination, and respectful care for an intelligent readership. As an example of that, I read one of his thousands of sentences about David, this one being about David Hockney. How he loved decanting those lines as he splayed out the Polaroid tiles into yet another portrait of his this or that other fond dear friend. Last week, Ren confirmed that he liked the line, though he'd forgotten he had ever written it. Today's talk, like many of his books and essays, is about the imagination and is speculative in the most poetic ways. Before getting to it, though, I wanted to remind us of his work on the darker side of human activity in the world, in which he exhibits ethical tact by working as a humble journalist, and I mean this as a highest form of praise, disappearing beneath brilliantly illuminating interviews before earning his own right to speak in his own voice. He wrote the following, for example, in his really wonderful 1990 A Miracle Universe, Settling Accounts with Torturers. This is Ren in his own voice. Torture impresses on the individual, and again, particularly individuals who've been living for others among others. The fact of the absolute solitude of human existence, which is finally, in its most extreme expression, solitude before death. That sort of knowledge, which ordinary people can ordinarily sustain for at most a few moments at a time, once in a long, long while, torture forces its victims to withstand for hours, days, weeks at a time. It is harrowing knowledge and is intended to harrow. The scream that comes welling out of the torture chamber is thus double, the body calling out to the soul and the self calling out to others. And in both cases, it goes unanswered. Torture's stark lesson is precisely that enveloping silence. It aims to take that silence and introject it back into its victim, to replace the flame of subjectivity with an abject, hollow void. Reading Weschler on the quirkiest parts of life always cheers me up and fills me with the illusion, at least, of possibility. The flip side of that bright side of his mind is his writing on torture and other depraved forms of human activity. But even his darker work finally feels affirming to me. Maybe that's because he brings to all of his writing a combination of passion, wonder, comedy, and searing but always measured moral focus. Something about his words leave me with a sense of seeing the world anew, for better or worse, and with a clarifying sense of irony about our condition. His language is always lucid, vibrant, and wonderfully rhythmic. His books are great, but what's maybe even more special to me personally is his keeping alive of the wonderful craft of the smart and creative journalist and his preserving of the cherished form of the long magazine essay. Now a few words about the Avenellis. And I told this brief story last time, so you'll indulge me. It is their generosity that for many years has made these lectures possible. Peter Avenelli was a young man during the Great Depression. His Berkeley education cost him $25 a semester, a price that included tickets to Cal football games. The son of an Italian immigrant, he graduated from Berkeley with a degree in English literature and then went to Harvard Business School and then to war. He spent 4.5 years in the Army, serving time on the front lines, including at the Battle of the Bulge, in which some 19,000 Americans lost their lives. Joan, a graduate of Sarah Lawrence, was in the Navy working as a radio operator in Madison when she met Peter. They married after 4 dates in 1945 during his 30-day leave from the Army, and they honeymooned in Lake Tahoe. I don't myself know what else there is to the Avenelli story, but if we put Ren on assignment, theirs would certainly emerge as infectious reading. Now here finally, before having Ren come to the podium, is him on his own work across the dark and light parts of his imagination. All of his work, he says, is, quote, all of his work is about people in the everydayness of their lives who suddenly come alive. People by themselves who are objects and who become subjects. It is all about passion. I insist upon enthusiasm. Enthusiasm comes from entheos, meaning the God introjected you. John Berger was my inspiration. Reading him gave me permission to do what I was doing anyway, to think that way without someone saying, where's your proof? I want to believe that making convergences is something everybody does and it gets trained out of them. Children do it. But people get bogged down in the quotidian. They stop seeing because they are told, stop it, it's silly. With that, please, Len, thank you.
Thank you, Alan, and it is a delight to be here in Berkeley. This is going to be a defense of loose synapse moments, as in my daughter's comments always, uh-oh, Daddy is having another loose synapsed moment. And I might start by saying that when I graduated from college, we had a family friend. It really is hot under this. Anyway, we had a family friend who was a shrink, and he said, why don't you come over and we'll do a bunch of tests and then we'll know what you should do. And, we did, so I went over and I did the 800 questions. I would rather be a tree or a frog. I would rather be a fire or a fireman, all this kind of stuff. And then we did the Rorschach test, all the other ones. And that's the famous Rorschach test. And he said, come back in a few weeks and we'll talk about it. So I came back a few weeks later and he said, well, we grade these Rorschach tests on all kinds of different indices. We grade them on erotic contact, aggression, this and that. But one of the things we grade them on is general free associative tendencies. And I've been calling around. Your score is so far off the chart that no one has ever seen a score like this, and this is not going to be good for you. You're going to have a very hard time staying put. And it's ironic. Now, why did that go there? I didn't want that. There it is. I hope it's not going by itself. We'll see. Anyway, but it was interesting because the very first book I wrote was clearly an attempt to get away from that. I wrote about Robert Irwin. We talked about him last week. And the thing about Robert Irwin is he had trained himself doggedly. His entire life work was a endless hours and hours and hours of training. Now stop it. Don't go. I didn't do anything. Why did that do that? We're going to have a problem. If the tech people can tell me why this is moving forward, that would be helpful. But anyway, his entire life was designed to get him not to associate with anything, to not think anything was a picture of anything, but to look at the thing itself. And our relationship, which began with my contacting him one day and turned into having lunches together every day for 3 years, consisted of me saying, you know what that reminds me of? And him saying, shut the fuck up. Can't you just look at something? Can't you just look at it? And in retrospect, I really realized that in a way, everything that occurs to him, he just kind of zens out and doesn't let it come in. And everything that occurs to me, I say right away to get it out, and then we both get to the same place. But anyway, and the book I wrote was called Seeing is Forgetting the Name of the Thing One Sees. What would it be like to look at this glass of water and not even remember that it's a glass, let alone that it's, what it's for or anything, but just to see it, and that reminds me, okay. Anyway, but so that I tried that, but it didn't work, and everything else has been one free association after another, and I eventually started doing a column for McSweeney's that were these convergence pieces, which they in turn eventually put into this book called Everything That Rises, a Book of Convergences. And to give you some idea what a convergence was, when two things kind of look alike, that's kind of like the rhyme, but the convergence is the poem. I mean, you have to write an essay that goes a little bit further than that. And I'll just give you some from the book, and then I'll move forward. This one here, on the right, on your left, Jackson Pollock, 1952. On the other side, Time Life Books, 1952. Time Life Books, Two Galaxies Colliding. And it turns out, interestingly, that when Pollock first started showing those paintings, that language of galactic, nebulae, all this kind of stuff was all over the place. In fact, one of my favorite reviews from the time said, "These paintings are so silent." Yeah, I mean, they're paintings, but I think what the person was meaning, they look so explosive that the silence is the silence of the vacuum. It's deafening silence. And so I said, so I started with that, and then I moved on to Rothko, and you know that Rothko, at a certain point begins doing these beautiful color paintings, these fields of color, these clouds that are kind of interjecting with each other, and very kind of mute, totemic, very, very powerful things to be in front of, and the standard history. Now stop it. Will you stop it? Why do you do that? Oh, no. Now I'm in big trouble. But the point being that he gets darker and darker, and then indeed, you can hardly see it, but it's black on red. And then at the end of his life, he is doing that kind of painting. And people are saying, oh, wow, you can see he's really depressed. And indeed, he commits suicide a few months after that painting. That's usually the biographical line about that. But in keeping with the Jackson Pollock, the interesting thing is one day I was going through the show, and I noticed the date of that painting, and it was summer 1969. And what else was going on in summer 1969? And the thing that's amazing, and I don't want to be reductive here. I don't want to say that Jackson Pollock, one of the great artists of our time, was painting what was on TV. But I do want to suggest what would it have been like for somebody like, Rothko. What would it have been like for Rothko, somebody with that moral imagination, to experience the moon landing? The greatest event of all time. Human beings get to the moon. And when they get there, what's there? Just nothing. I mean, it's just, emptiness. One of my favorite lines about the moon landing was you could tell it was daytime because the ground was shining. But anyway, that's an example of the kind of thing. And the whole thing about not being reductive is very important, too. Go back. The whole thing about not being reductive is important because in all these cases, just think about them, take them a little bit, let them go, take it or leave it. One day I was with a friend who was showing me this book of photographs. This is not good what's going on here, but this friend was showing me this book of photographs, and this is in Venezuela, and I said, oh my God, it's the Rokeby Venus. And, my friend said, I don't know. And then I said, well, wait a second. Now, this is really terrible. But anyway, one interesting thing here is there's a line right there of a path. And that got me to thinking, wait a second, the Rokeby Venus is the Man Ray lips. Look especially over here what happens. And then I said, okay, well, now I'm going crazy. I've got to stop. By the way, this picture is called The Hour of the Observatory. And what's interesting... Oh, darn it. This is really a problem. I don't know why it's doing this. Anyway, it's called The Hour of the Observatory because Lee Miller, Man Ray's mistress, had just left him. And... when they set up the time zones around the world and the 0 degrees latitude being Greenwich, the vote at the time had been 42-1, with one country just not choosing Greenwich, and that was France. And France insisted that the observatory outside Paris was 0 degrees. And it was that way till 1914, actually. When they needed help from England, they had to coordinate, so France reluctantly went to 0 degrees being Greenwich. But so this is the moment when Man Ray, his mistress Lee Miller, has left him, and it's the hour of the observatory. It's 0 degrees. Anyway, as I was saying, I was thinking I was going crazy, and you've already seen the punchline, but then I saw a photograph that Man Ray himself took. And what's really weird about that is the picture above is Man Ray, 1933, Paris. The same year, Chagall in Paris does that painting. So, I mean, those are examples. One last example from the Book of Convergences is this one here. On your right, the famous 1895 instance when a train overshot the Gare du Nord, probably because it was on Greenwich time, I suspect. But and on the left, Magritte's painting, Le Temps Duré. And what's interesting about Le Temps Duré is what you suddenly realize is back in 1884 when they did the Congress that just set up time zones. They did it mainly because of transcontinental trains. It used to be that time was real in every city that you went to. It was zero when it was noon on the solstice at the highest point. That made noon, and it meant that a town that was 60 miles west of New York City would have time that was 3 minutes off from New York City. It meant that the train that went between New York and Chicago had to have 17 separate clocks on board for the 17 towns it went through. And you can imagine schedules were a complete nightmare. And so that's why they eventually came up with the time zones. But you can also imagine that if you were a 6-year-old boy in 1884, hearing all this stuff about, well, what time is it here if it's this time there and that time there, you might grow up to be Einstein and do a theory of relativity, which uses trains as the metaphor. I'm miserable. I'm miserable. You're getting to see all my jokes before I'm ready for them. Anyway. But I was starting to say that the theory of relativity is all about lightning striking the tracks at the same time. What does that mean, according to who, and so forth. And that could have easily come from that. Anyway, point is, I indeed wrote the book. We then had a contest online at McSweeney's website called the Convergence Contest, and people began to send in their own convergences. What's happening is it seems to be...
Let's take this off, see if that's going to help.
Okay, great. Perfect. Thank you. I bet you that does help. Anyway, no, it didn't help. Anyway, but that was one that one person sent in. That's Goya, Saturn eating his children, and on the other side is George W. Bush. And then somebody said, well, you think that's bad? There's a whole epidemic of this sort of thing. Now it's getting really crazy. It's going faster and faster. On the left, you have women in the West Bank on an outing, and on the right, you have the Klan in 1924 on an outing in Iowa City. This was a fantastic one. This is a one-picture convergence. This is clear-cutting a forest in Sweden as seen from the air. And you can understand why. They don't want the people on the roads to see what's going on, so they do a road, and then they cut everything they can, and they take it out. This was one of my favorites. This is a lady who's just swum the English Channel, and the person said it reminded them of Christ being taken off the cross. And it turns out the one nice thing that the lady, Christ doesn't have to deal with the paparazzi. Unless you consider the old masters to be the paparazzi of the Passion. In which case, but it turns out there's an awful lot of Christological imagery in Convergences, so that somebody felt that their father putting up the clothesline was just like Iwo Jima. And you suddenly realize that the reason Iwo Jima, that photograph, independently, every editor in the country that morning, seeing photographs from all over the war, all over the place that the war was going on, and every editor in the country put that photograph on the cover. And I'm convinced that the reason they did it is because it had been prepared for them they'd already seen it, in a sense. All the paintings of the raising of the cross, which in effect there with Iwo Jima turns the entire Pacific campaign into a Stations of the Cross and has implicit a resurrection on the far side and so forth. And that's all, I think, subliminally there. In a way, I'm trying to talk about how images prepare the way for other images. Anyway, eventually somebody sent in this one. which is this is all by way of prologue, and somebody sends in this one and says that that painting down below by Erich Fischl had to have been based on Uccello. And it is pretty amazing if you look at it, that little cyclone up at the top with the Bruce Naumann. The Erich Fischl, by the way, is part of his Krefeld series. He hired a group of actors to live in this house and play out this demented, kind of sexual crazy game. And there's a lot of paintings in this series. But look at how the woman on the chair is kind of like the horse person. The man with his, with his wings, the dragon-like splay of wings behind him in the shadows. His kind of phallic water bottle. The woman, the princess, being in the painting on the side of the woman descending a staircase by Richter. Anyway, somebody said to me, this has got to be, based on that. Now, at that point, I began to think, well, wait a second, what's going on when you see a convergence? I mean, what could it be? Could it be coincidence? Could it be, what? And I decided I had enough instances to kind of lay out all kinds of effects. And so from here on in, I'm going to kind of be like a butterfly collector from the 19th century, and I have all these little drawers. I'm going to pull out this drawer of this kind of effect. And we're going to look at a whole natural history of convergences, try to figure out different kinds of things that happen, and in effect do a taxonomy of convergences from one extreme to the other. And we start with apophenia, which is one of my favorite words, and it certainly applies to me. It's the tendency of people to see patterns where there are no patterns. And a very good instance of this, and now I have to go, maybe when I leave here and go to this thing, I'll be able to get out of it. But I want to show you this here, I'll make it big, is some of you may have seen the film, Godard's film, 2 or 3 Things I Know About Her. And by the way, those of you who have seen it on DVD have not seen it. It used to be that we went to movie theaters. And the thing that was amazing in this particular film, the her in the picture, by the way, is Paris, the city of Paris. But this woman goes, and I'll just start it up here. Let's see. And she's at a cafe, and at a certain point, she puts the creamer, the coffee in her, looks at the coffee in the cup. Let's see, I'll move it. And by the way, Godard, I don't know if you can hear it here. I guess it's not. Anyway, he's just this is Godard's voice blathering on. But the point is that at a certain point, the whole camera fills up with her, the whole screen fills up with her view inside the cup. It starts out like this. Again, I'll move it forward a bit. And eventually becomes the whole, and if you're at a movie theater, the whole screen is this. And I challenge you to look at that without thinking of galaxies, of all kinds of associations you might have. It goes on. And by the way, look at the guy's lips as he's smoking, and then the next, and this absolutely has the look of cells dividing and that kind of thing. Only in a second it does something very weird. And it goes back to his lips, and then it continues and it comes back. And one of the things is it's out of focus at this point. And Godard is blathering on, where is the beginning, but what beginning? God created heaven and earth, but one should be able to put it better. And Godard in his kind of husky, crazy voice. And then look what begins to happen. And then he suddenly makes it into. And once again, I challenge you to look at that and not have all sorts of associations, and that's what we call apophenia, because it's just coffee in a cup, Now let's go back here and go to presenter view and pray that it stops doing what it was doing. Anyway, as I say, that's apophenia. A little bit further along the thing from apophenia is the notion of projection, that we project onto the world, and that's what you have in Rorschach tests, for example, that you might think you're seeing things in this picture. If you go a little bit further into projection and kind of become obsessively projecting, you get paranoia. For example, there's that movie, The Number 23, that Carrie is in, and he starts adding, everything starts adding up to 23. Everything is 23. Everything is 23. This is the 23rd slide. Anyway, but moving along, you get some of the more endearing things that happen. You get the Protocols of the Elder of Zion, which in this edition tells you that the Jews are responsible for capitalism, masonry, Christianity, Nazism, and communism. So that's pretty good. And then you've got this other guy here, God and Obama. Neither has a birth certificate. That guy has it figured out. So moving along, we started with just pure apophenia and then kind of projection, and then we get to accident or coincidence. Two things are alike because, well, one example is chance and the shuffle of things. And for example, one day in The Economist, I noticed that the guy going through the outdoor tunnel there ended up in the picture next door to it. And that's the kind of thing where you can say, well, it's not that unusual because there are all the days that doesn't happen, but occasionally it does. This is a little bit weirder. This was the ad in The Economist on the back page the week before 9/11. A truly bad advertising campaign for Lufthansa, and then the following week at Time magazine. One variety of this sort of thing is the famous separated at birth phenomenon, where people look exactly alike. It is, of course, the case that Don Knotts and Mick Jagger look exactly alike. I don't know what to make of that. Gets a little bit weirder as you go along. In fact, Charlie Watts is a dead ringer for Buster Keaton, which is weird because Buster Keaton is a dead ringer and Samuel Beckett knew it for Samuel Beckett. And in fact, Samuel Beckett had Buster Keaton as an actor in some films he made. But what do we make of the fact that one of the people who loved Buster Keaton more than anybody else was Ludwig Wittgenstein? In the book, I have a whole thing about, and this is getting farther and farther away from people, but some of you remember the last time, not this time, but the last time before that, the government got shut down by Gingrich. And just around the same time, these guys were sharing covers all the time. Milosevic, the Serbian commander, and Gingrich, and I did an entire essay about this convergence in the book called Pillsbury Doughboy Messiahs. Recently, Colbert used my idea. But the funny thing about Pillsbury Doughboy was I was making an argument, actually, that they had remarkably similar careers, and I don't mean that Gingrich was a war criminal, but rather that he was completely cynical himself. He had no beliefs. In fact, to set up his big winning thing, he had a contract with America which was based on polling. And then those were his beliefs. But the trouble is he brought out a whole bunch of fanatics behind him who really believed things. And in the same way, Milosevic didn't believe in Serbian nationalism. He was just a bureaucrat. He was a communist bureaucrat. But one day he was giving a speech and he noticed that was really worked. And so he started leading this whole thing. But then the people behind him became wilder and wilder, and he wasn't able to control them. And so both of them had that kind of arc to their careers. What's fascinating, though, is that this Pillsbury Doughboy Messiah phenomenon is just rampant all over the Republican galaxy. You get Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck. Look at it, they're all the same person. I mean, it's weird. Scalia and Dick Morris and Ken Rove. And of course, there's and maybe this is why they are all so popular, is the godfather of the Pillsbury Doughboys, Roger Ailes, who figured out the idea of putting the bimbettes on the TV thing, and that always reminded me of that other scene. Anyway, and it turns out that the Pillsbury Doughboy Messiah phenomenon has historical roots. Once you see it, you start seeing it everywhere, and I called my friend John Hodgman to ask him what he thought of it, and he didn't know what I was talking about. So you have separated at birth, you have transubstantiated in death. This is the phenomenon where you start seeing Jesus on or Mother Mary on toast. She shows up a lot of places in stains of various sorts and so forth. Jesus shows up. This thing on the left was amazing. This was a town way in the outback in Australia. Excuse me, on the right, where the shadows of a tree cast were convinced to be Jesus's face, and this town, which had a hotel, which had 3 rooms in the hotel and nothing else for hundreds of miles, suddenly had 10,000 people descend on it, which continued to be a problem until the fall, in which case the leaves went away. The Shroud of Turin. The point is, you get this also all over the world. This was during the middle of the Intifada. A lamb was born with the word Allah on its side. Then you have the whole jelly bean problem. And then this is one of the more interesting ones. There was the year after John Paul died, John Paul II, there was a bonfire in Krakow. This is when they were saying that he should become made a saint as quickly as possible. And somebody took a photograph of the bonfire and did not notice at the time, as of course he would not until he got home. And this was, and then he put it up, and then this was all over the papers, all over Poland, and this was further proof that John Paul should be made a saint. And of course, there was no moment, literally no moment, when it looked like this. It was just the split second of a camera shot that had it, but this became very important. It happened that at the same time there was a Maurizio Catalan show in Warsaw with the famous image of his image of the Pope being felled by a meteorite. This was hugely controversial. It had to be shut down. Good, Pope on fire. Bad, Pope hit by a meteorite. But then finally you get similar sorts of things like this, which, what do you want? I don't know. Anyway, so we will call all of those coincidences of one sort or another. Now we're beginning to move further. I've got another chest of drawers here, and this chest is something which we might call affinities. And this is the thing where you begin to have, Picasso had this incredible affinity for the work that he was finding at the Musée de l'Homme. And Max Ernst, and there was basically, at the turn of the 20th century, there was all kinds of interest in, quote, primitive art. There have been controversies about whether the uses of this kind of thing in display and who's using who, but the fact of the matter is that there was an affinity. I would argue that the affinity was that artists were trying to get past one-point perspective, and the way they were doing it was in various places where there never had been one-point perspective. And so you found it over and over again. In more recent years, there's been, the Africans have been great. They've turned it around. There is a artist from Benin named Ramold Hazume who takes Western detritus, gasoline cans and brushes and earphones, and turns them into modernist primitive objects. Now we're moving along, and we go to a phenomenon called co-causation, which is to say that things look alike because, in fact, they're caused by the same thing. Thus, for example, this was quite striking. At the time of Abu Ghraib, that famous image of the man being tortured, repeated exactly the image of the monument for the missing of the Somme. And the reason, of course, is they both come out of Christian iconography. And what's strange about the image, the case of the Abu Ghraib one, is that they're taking two Christian stories and putting them on top of each other. They're based the crucifixion, but also the mocking of Christ. As you'll remember, there was a wire around the guy's finger. He was hooded. For all he knew, he was about to be electrocuted. It wasn't that hilarious that he was freaking out because they knew he wasn't actually hooked in. But so when you see something like this happening, it's that both of them are kind of steeped in a kind of Christian imagery. In the world of nature, you'll have on entirely different phyla will have the same strategy. You'll have flying suddenly showing up among birds, among mammals, among insects. And in fact, that thing I showed you a while back that I said was Apophenia is not at all Apophenia. It turns out there's an entire book. In fact, the guy was here in town the other day. Cindy Perkowitz is a physicist who has written a book called Universal Foam from Cappuccino to the Cosmos, which is to say that the rules that govern what's going on in your coffee cup are the same rules that do, in fact, keep galaxies circulating and so forth. So those are examples of co-causation. There's sub-examples. For example, we get to fractalization. Are you keeping up with me? They're all on the little sheet there. Fractalization is the sort of thing when you get snowflakes and the arms and the snowflakes look just like the snowflake, and then the arms of those look like that, and so forth. It's the reason that if you take a microscopic shot of pebbles of sand, they look just like telescopic shots of asteroids. The great person who figured this all out was the remarkable mathematician Benoit Mendelbaum, and that was the set. It got to the point where you could design artificial, and this is in fact very important in computer graphics. These are all repeating patterns that end up making entire landscapes, so that you can create landscapes that look like this, that are entirely generated mathematically. It turns out to be very easy. You use that formula. And you begin to see it everywhere. One of the more interesting things that I have encountered is the sense you have when you look at the stock market plunging, for example, that it's like a mountain range. This was the famous momentary lapse where all the different computers started feeding on each other, and you got this terrible catastrophic cliff that lasted a few minutes and then it went back up again. It turns out that there is a German artist named Michael Nadjar, who is a mountain climber, and he has gone on expeditions, and particularly this series of images I'll show you are from Argentina, and he then photoshops the imagery so that, for example, this is one of his photographs, but it's been photoshopped to show you exactly the Nikkei averages over a 10-year period. And that was the Dow Jones over a 10-year period. And my favorite one, Lehman Brothers from 1992 to 2008. But what's amazing about this is that in an essay by the British curator of the show of this thing named Paul Wombell, he found a remarkable painting from 1570, because this is nothing new about the relationship between bankers and art, bankers and so forth. And in 1570, there was a painter named Maso di Sanfriano who made this painting called The Diamond Mines. And apparently, according to the research, the mountains are following the prices of diamonds. So it goes all the way back. Then we get to another sort of thing that's co-causation, which is branching structures. And here, for example, does anybody know what that is? It's actually, I have it as the end paper of the book. And, some of you I heard say, it's a root system, it's maybe organic, in some kind of organic thing, it might be brain dendrites and so forth. No, what this is if you take a piece of lucite, a slab of lucite, and you take it to your nearest linear accelerator, and you zap it with X gazillion watts, and you pull it out, it will be super saturated with stray electrons, by which is meant there's not room for one more stray electron. And they are dying to get out, but lucite is an insulator, so they can't get out. Now, if you hold that thing upside down from the way it looks there, and you put a nail there, and you hammer it, every single electron will rush to get out simultaneously. They will self-organize into that pattern. It's a fractal pattern. If you looked at a microscopic image of what's happening right there, it would look exactly the same way. And arguably, the reason that dendrites look that way, or the reason that leaves look that way, or so forth, is that they are, in fact, representations of the electric. And by the way, it's what happens in a cloud when there isn't a lightning bolt. The little thing has it, and all the electricity comes together, it comes down. It's what happens when you have rivers, deltas. It's what happens when you have trees, leaves, dendrites in the brain. It's actually quite fascinating to think about. One of the questions I often wonder is whether we think in terms of decision trees, for example, because our brains are shaped that way. And I've been having conversations with people about that here, and it's an interesting question. You get, indeed, this is Ad Reinhardt's genealogical tree of art, and this is Picasso and Matisse and Braque, and then it breaks down into all the artists of his time. On the other side there you have Beth Campbell, who's a wonderful contemporary artist who, if you invite her to come to your gallery, she'll take a wall and she'll take a pencil and she'll work on a decision tree of something she's trying to decide what to do. In this case, whether or not she should be a lesbian. She thinks about it very deeply. So then we also have the things look like happen simultaneously, which is why Europe is super saturated with the idea of calculus. There's not room for one more idea before you get calculus, and that Newton and Leibniz get it simultaneously. Interestingly, Darwin and Wallace get the idea of evolution simultaneously as a branching structure. On the far extreme of this co-causation, things look the same because they're identical. One of the earliest ones were floaters. When you go outside and you're looking at the sky and there's that thing that's kind of floating around, it looks like some cells, and you're looking and it begins to flow this way, and you kind of move your eyes and so forth. And the reason those things look like cells is because they are dead cells. And indeed, at the time when people began seeing microscopic cells for the first time, they said, you know what they look like? They look like, when you go outside, and they are called floaters, and they are dead cells floating in the middle of the vitreous fluid. And oddly enough, the optics of the eyes allows you to see like a microscope. Another version of this was what happens, when you go to have your doctor looks in your eye during your physical and so forth, and you kind of see those red veins floating around. And he's not looking at that to see anything about your vision. It happens that is a place where your blood cells, the back of your eye, is a place where the blood vessels are easiest to see. It's interesting because Percival Lovell, who was an amateur astronomer, the reason there's so many Lovell telescopes around the world, Percival Lovell had become convinced that there were canals on Mars, and that's his drawing of the canal systems he saw on Mars. And if you've ever played with a telescope, you often have that phenomenon where it becomes an ophthalmoscope, where if you look at it wrong, you see the inside of the thing. In his case, he had very, very pronounced veins on the inside of his eyes, or must have, because if you have that, what the doctor's looking for, if it's really pronounced, is you are going to have high likelihood of a stroke, which is exactly what Percival Lovell died of at the age of 61. This stands in for my elementary school, although it's not my elementary school, but this is Main Street School, and this will give you some idea of how the world has changed. When I was 29 as a young reporter, I had a great idea for a story, and I went back to my old elementary school, to the kindergarten playground, and I asked the kids to tell me the jokes. And they were exactly the same jokes that had been there when I was there. All of them filthy, raunchy, told with complete abandon and cluelessness. Emily comes home and tells her mommy, I just made $1. How did you make $1? Because the boys bet me I wouldn't climb the pole. Oh, silly. They just wanted to see your underpants. Well, I fooled them. I wasn't wearing any. And I suddenly realized that maybe the real organisms on this planet are the jokes. And there's a whole ecosystem of jokes that lives at LeMay Street School, and there's this kind of river of humanity that flows through, and that the way you could really figure things out is if you would just pay attention to the right thing. One last case of identity. There's a McDonald's in Brooklyn that has these beautiful things on the wall that look exactly like Rothko's on their side. Because they are Rothko's on their side. So don't say McDonald's is not a cultural marker in the world. Similarly, we get to the issue of Zeitgeist, where suddenly things just start showing up everywhere. You get for some reason, in the last 10 years, we've been having vampires everywhere. There's entire classes at this university offered to why we're having vampires all over the place. One of the things that's interesting about the Zeitgeist is it almost always takes the form, it comes in binary form, so that when the Beatles arrive, you also get the Rolling Stones. There's kind of a vanilla version and a spicy version. When Michael Jackson happens, you'll get Prince. When Madonna happens, you'll get Cyndi Lauper. This happens across things. It happens in politics. When Malcolm X happens, you get Martin Luther King also. Here's a really interesting sense of the Zeitgeist. There were two films that were being made simultaneously a few years ago that both had to do with women, extremely depressed women, and both of them had the same construct. They came out the same week. Clearly the directors could not have known about each other. One of them was Another Earth, where the notion was that this separate Earth had come into view of our Earth. The other was Melancholia, where there was a whole other planet that was coming in view of our Earth. In both cases, the women would spend hours looking up at the thing in question. And in both cases, the obvious thing a depressed woman would do faced with this thing is go out and lie naked in the light and be photographed diagonally exactly the same way. Now there I think you could probably argue that what the deep structure there is Artemis, the moon goddess, who is portrayed naked and so forth. And so maybe that's what was going on. Then we get to the phenomenon of cross metaphors, where something happens in the world, and the next morning every single political cartoonist uses it. So when the Costa Concordia sinks, the next morning every single cartoonist uses it as a metaphor for the economy, and whether or not the captain left early, and what should be done, and things like that. This is not that dissimilar from the phenomenon of memes, which you could go on at endless length. One of the more recent ones was the pepper spraying cop, who suddenly started showing up everywhere. Okay, now we're beginning. So up till now, we've been kind of playing with things that happen in social and cultural milieux and so forth. Now we're beginning to get to artists themselves. So we started at the extreme, just coincidence, and now we're getting artists who are actually playing off each other in different interesting ways. And so we have the phenomenon of direct influence. Direct influence goes both backwards and forwards, as is famously the case with the Aeneid, where Virgil goes to Hades, and then when Dante writes the Divine Comedy, he has Virgil Virgil tells the story of going to Hades, and when Dante writes the Divine Comedy, he keeps playing off of Virgil. In fact, Virgil is his guide. And then T.S. Eliot, years later, will make the case that not only does Virgil have a huge influence on the Divine Comedy, but the Divine Comedy has a huge influence on Virgil. That we can't help today read Virgil without having the Divine Comedy in mind. He was making a case that you would not ever be able to look at either of them without thinking of T.S. Eliot. And to some extent, he's right. A very strange one of these, by the way, which is kind of backwards and forwards, is the phenomenon of the Christ story and Socrates. Those of you who have read the last days of Socrates, the Apology and so forth, you can't help but notice how similar the story is to the Christ story. I mean, that the person is turned in, that there's a vote, that he has a chance to escape, he doesn't escape, he chooses to stay. All this kind of stuff goes on. And in fact, when you get to the Christian story, you have this very strange piece of language in the Bible where he says, "Let this cup pass me by." There is no cup. The cup is the cup of hemlock from Socrates' story. And what's interesting about this is it goes both directions. In other words, at the time of Palestine around the year 0, you had dozens and dozens of mystery cults and messianic cults. And it was partly because in the early days you had kind of like with time zones, you'd had all these local cults, but with the Hellenistic period they start bumping up against each other and so forth, and you get all kinds of crazy transcendence, this wild sense of transcendence. And they're all going to be competing with each other to move forward. And is it possible that the one that ends up winning is the one, especially with intellectuals, is the one that rhymes the story they already know, the Socrates story? Conversely, there are all kinds of amazing philosophers in 5th century Greece, really great philosophers. Is it possible that the one that we think of as the greatest, Socrates or Plato, is because the medieval Christian monks who are writing all this, or transmitting the things, tell that story over and over again because it rhymes with the Christian story? I mean, there's this kind of thing going both forward and backwards, and I would argue that's how history works. So now there's there's forward, backward, there's conscious and unconscious. Conscious is when Kurt Vonnegut looks exactly like Mark Twain, because he very consciously, and you could have added Richard Brautigan as another one who does, and they very consciously are saying that. You get apprenticeship. The reason two things look alike is because one was the apprentice of the other. There's a whole shows about Rembrandt who had like 6 or 7 major students, and they're constantly confusing Rembrandt's for the work of his students or vice versa. This is what connoisseurship is all about. Or in the case of my grandfather, that's my grandfather on the left, Ernst Toch, who apprenticed himself in his own mind to Mozart. And basically, he was being discouraged to study, and he basically, from the age of 8, 9, 10, would take Mozart string quartets and just copy them out. And then would go up to the repeat, and then he would do his own, and then he'd go back to look at Mozart and so forth. And so you, in fact, get all kinds of things in his work that alludes that way. Another thing that's fascinating, this is now apprenticeship, this is kind of institutional apprenticeship, is the phenomenon of template. And here I have to go out of here just again for a second and show you this thing back here. Let me see if this thing here. What's fascinating here, watch this, is what happens in Walt Disney. Time and again in Walt Disney cartooning, they will use the same template. The reason these two scenes look alike is they are exactly the same anatomical studies. This is the Jungle Book and Winnie the Pooh. I could have shown you Little Mermaid and Cinderella. Over and over again, Disney's animators do this. Isn't this amazing? Wow. Demand your money back. But this is, you could have looked at if you go to Fra Angelico's San Marco in Florence, there are all the minor monks get these chapels, and they all have exactly the same template of Christ crucified in exactly the same way with different scenes happening underneath. And so forth. Okay, now let's go back to my... oops, sorry. Get rid of that. We can now get rid of this. We can get rid of this. We can go back to here. And to slideshow. So there's that phenomenon. Another phenomenon along these lines is permission. And here's the thing where things look alike because a great master does something and that gives permission for other people to do it. A good example here is when Bob Dylan suddenly goes electric. And that allows both other folk singers to go electric and other electric singers to start having content to their lyrics. It's, in effect, they've been given permission by Bob Dylan. These are all conscious phenomena. Then you get unconscious phenomena, the overriding cultural frame. So, for example, John Berger, the great English critic, the day that this picture was published, the picture of Che Guevara having been killed and on display, a few months later, he published a piece saying, we all know what this picture is based on. The image, as it were, hot-wired in the brains of the photographer that taught him where to take the picture from, in the mind of the generals that taught them where to stand. This is obviously based on Rembrandt's anatomy lesson. And I remember reading that as a high school senior and saying, God, this guy does not read the newspaper the way I read the newspaper, but this is a really cool way to read the newspaper. Another example of unconscious is guilty conscience. Here's a weird story. On the left is a Nazi poster encouraging families to have big families, the good Nazi, the good German folk to have more and more children for the war effort. Putin, about 10 years ago, got on the same kick that he was frightened that there's a big problem in Russia. There's a huge collapse in population, and he tried to get. He ordered that there be posters to try and get Russian families to have children, and this poster appeared. So what's going on here? I mean, is it a very sly, dissident designer who says, "Oh yeah, I know this guy," or is it somebody just going on online and saying, "I need a picture of a family, happy family. Oh, that's a good picture," and so forth. But in any case, it has kind of the guilty conscience that plays out. You also have the phenomenon, unconscious phenomenon of the anxiety of influence. A good example there is David Hockney. It's obvious that the major artistic influence on David Hockney is Matisse. Both of them painters of the pleasures of bourgeois life. Time and again, you get Hockneys that are playing off of Matisse. He will never, ever, ever mention Matisse. In much the same way that I have no interest whatsoever in Jung. I talk about Freud all the time. Jung is just like, not true, doesn't matter, not interesting to me. So now we're moving along. We get to another conscious strategy, which is allusion. That comes in different styles. You get invocation, which is why we talked about this last week when Rembrandt was painting that painting. He was invoking a whole history of paintings of Christ. The thief on the plinth was like Mantegna's Christ. I am absolutely convinced that in turn is why you see this. That going through that Shea picture, the photograph, you have the connection to the Rembrandt, and by way of the Rembrandt to Christ, and it implies a resurrection and a life and a resurrection. If if it had happened that Che looked like this the day he was killed, it wouldn't have worked. Does anybody know who that is? That's Che Guevara in his passport photo as an Argentinian businessman that he used to go to after the Cuban Revolution to Africa. But you have the same sort of thing with invocation, for example, famously with Goya going to Manet. In the picture at the top, you have a picture that Goya does of Napoleonic soldiers after the Battle of Madrid executing the defenders of Madrid. It's playing again off of Christian archetypes with the hands out. But what happens some years later, these are Napoleon's forces doing that to Madrid. Then Napoleon III sends Archduke Maximilian to be his vassal, his representative, running Mexico for a few years. There's a revolution that overturns him, and it ends up being Mexican troops shooting the French. And Manet sees this and puts them together. And again, by the way, a whole kind of Christian thing where you have the sombrero as a halo, you have the two flanked by two guys, and so forth. But this is very conscious on the part of Manet. Then you get a thing which is homage as opposed to invocation. And homage is the sort of thing which happens again with David Hockney, who will not shut up talking about Picasso. He won't talk about Manet, about Matisse, but he talks about Picasso endlessly and imagines himself to be, Picasso to be his mentor, to him to be the young student. Over and over again, you'll get things where he consciously plays with Picasso-like images, and he was extremely pleased, as you may know. He loves talking about how important it is that he be allowed to smoke and how catastrophic it is that smokers' rights are being violated. And when he was at the Picasso Museum, he posed for that photo. In much the same way, I would say this entire lecture is my homage to my master, John Berger. Then you have puns. This happens a lot in films. This is why you get The Passion of Spider-Man. Or you might remember the great scene in MASH, where suddenly you're in the Last Supper. A somewhat more interesting thing is the phenomenon of pastiche. And one of the things that's great about pastiches is they teach you something about the original that you might not have noticed. Last week I was talking about how we don't understand how people used to look at paintings, and in this case, Las Maninas. I was in Madrid recently, and there was a ad for the Cortes Inglés, I think is ad. They had, isn't that clever? They instead of having the painter, they have a photographer, and it's set up the same way. And the notion is that he is looking in the mirror, snapping a photograph of the scene, and that in fact is how we think of the painting by Velázquez, whereas, of course, that's not at all what happened. As we were talking about last week, he spent months working on the dog, on this person, on that person. He would do it separately. And anybody at the time would have known this, how to look at a picture. But it's only now that, in the wake of photography, that we look at pictures wrong and imagine there was a moment where they all kind of stood there like that. Similarly, you have David LaChapelle doing his version of a still life, a Dutch still life, only he has phones and things in it and so forth. What's interesting about Dutch still life, of course, is that there was never a moment when the bouquet looked like that. It would have rotted while he was painting. He painted each flower by itself and made it into a bouquet, and that's how you're supposed to read those paintings. And those paintings, when you go to the museum, are some of those fascinating paintings at the museum. You always walk right by them. But they're incredibly interesting. Another of my masters, Harry Berger, has written a book called Caterpillage about these paintings. And there's insane stuff going on, especially if you look at it at each flower individually, how they're related to the others and so forth. Conversely, when David LaChapelle does that photograph, he has to have waited for some of the flowers to have wilted and other ones to be fresh. He didn't just get one bouquet of flowers. He had to kind of create that effect. So that's playing with the way pastiche is showing. Then you got, finally, we're getting very close to the end here. The parody is a good thing. This is this phenomenon. I am convinced, and if any of you can find it for me, that it was the same thing with a quail. With Dan Quayle, people thought that he looked just like Alfred E. Newman. And I haven't been able to find it. And that would say something about George Bush Sr.'s idea of sun figures. But anyway, but the Nation, of course, did this thing during the Obama campaign, and it drove the Republicans crazy, and they just couldn't get over it. And then they did this parody of the Nation. If Obama was a Republican, the Nation would do that, played off hopeless. Then Mad Magazine finally caught on and did their own cover during the inauguration. Then you have quotation. The reason things look like this is direct quotes. This happens in Melville all the time. It's obvious, anybody who reads Moby Dick, that he has been reading Shakespeare and King James Bible voraciously before he is writing. You get entire passages where that's going on. Velázquez, I won't go into the whole story here, but when he does the spinners, the image in the back is Titian's. You can see it back here. There's a long story that goes with that, but I'll move on right now. And now we get to appropriation. And the reason things look alike, when Andy Warhol does a Campbell soup can, it looks just like a Campbell soup can because he's appropriating the image of a Campbell soup can. But one of the things he's doing is playing with Rothko. He's doing a pop version of Rothko. He does a Brillo pad. And of course, not only is he appropriating these things, but he's appropriating the strategy from Duchamp. And Duchamp, who famously, or so the story says, went into a hardware store, found a urinal, and signed it, put it in a gallery, and said, "This is art because I say it's art." That, however, is not actually what happened, and it's important to understand that. He took a urinal and put it on its side. And on its side, when you look at Stieglitz's photograph of it under Duchamp's lighting conditions, it has an incredibly Buddhist, holy-like kind of shrine-like quality. That's what's interesting about it. It's not just a urinal. And in fact, it looks very much like a pieta. That in turn, if you'll allow me a few moments, leads, as you might remember, to the famous Laszlo Toth, who in 1972 attacked the pieta, breaking one of the fingers, as I recall, and so forth. He was an anarchist, and he yelled, as he was attacking the pieta, he yelled, "No more masterpieces." What's interesting about that story, however, is that a few years ago, somebody named, what's his name? I've got to get his name right for you. Pinoncelli, Pablo Pinoncelli, I believe, attacked the urinal in Nîmes. And this is fantastic. It turns out that he was an inmate up the road in Saint-Rémy, where Van Gogh was an inmate. And he attacked the urinal and chipped it. He subsequently photographed himself at. But what's great about this is that when he was put on trial, it turned out this was the second time he'd attacked it. That he'd attacked it 6 years earlier when it was on display at the Centre Pompidou. Only at that time, he had done something truly inspired. He had peed into it. Which is to say, and his defense was that after he had peed into it, the object was living in a rictus of embarrassment, being gawked at as art when all it wanted to be was a urinal. And that's why he was trying to put it out of its misery when he attacked it. Going a step forward, we come to a thing I got just today, as the people at the Institute will testify, from my friend Alexander Melamed of the great Komar and Melamed team from some years ago, who has started, quote, the Institute of Responsible Re-Education for Artists. And I'll read you the memo because it's, I think, important for the artists here. Art calls for reverence. We, the cultured, venerate art. We believe unequivocally that art is the best, blah, blah, blah. Good gracious. Moreover, it gives a chance to make tons of money, do away with office slavery, and be rewarded with artistic license. Sounds great. So every year, thousands upon thousands of young men and women flock to art schools in pursuit of a dream and a buck. God bless them. But as we all know, most of the dreamers will be awoken at a certain age by the harsh reality of crushed dreams, lost opportunities, moneyless future, and the lack of any marketable skills. Too bad. That's why I, Alexander Melamed, have started the Institute of Responsible Re-Education for fledgling artists in New York City. We teach skills to the people of relatively low IQ and proclivities for tinkering, the type of individuals from whom most artists are recruited. We offer a series of certificates in trades like appliance repair, audio repair, plumbing, and so forth. And he gives you the list. And he says, and many more. But first, they have to take the 3 steps art detoxification program or art rehab at our facilities in New York. And for the thesis, students will be required to connect a urinal to the sewer of the art gallery. By that, modern art that originated in the pissoir of Marcel Duchamp will be reconnected at last with the sewage system of the great city. And we can get rid of all the bullshit. Bless his soul. Anyway, by the way, there's all sorts of other instances of people, Sherry Levine doing the pissoir, Liza Liu, and so forth. Now we get to cryptomnesia. I won't tell you, we're a bit late, so I won't tell you this whole story about this extraordinary phenomenon where people will copy entire paragraphs from other people without realizing they're doing it. Actually, I will tell you very quickly this story. This is actually an interesting story. I'm sorry I'm talking so long, but these are fun stories. And if you wouldn't laugh, I would have finished it faster. Anyway, in this case, I was working at the New Yorker. The New Yorker had published a piece by Oliver Sacks that you might remember called To See or Not See, which was about a masseur who had been blind his whole life, but was married to a very messianic wife, and who contacted a very messianic doctor who was going to give the masseur his vision. And at the age of 42, I think it was, this guy gets his vision, and it's horrifying. Because it turns out that it's kind of like language. If you don't have a language by the time you're 13, you are not going to be able to do language. You will be able to say book, but you will not be able to say the book is on the shelf. And the same way, if you do not have visual language, you will not be able to understand how the hand, and this is one of the examples that he uses, is this huge thing, whereas the person over there is small and tiny, and it's just complete confusion. And in fact, the man begged to be allowed to be blind again and go back to how he had been. This ran in the New Yorker. A year later, as that was my wont, I would go read the galleys of pieces that were coming through, and I read the galley of John Lahr's piece about a fantastic new play by Brian Friel. Brian Friel is a fantastic playwright. He is going to win the Nobel Prize someday. He's a major, major playwright. And there were long passages quoting passages from the play about a masseur, in this case a woman, who is blind, who is given vision by her doctor, and she's freaked out by how big the hands are, and things like that. Entire paragraphs that the New Yorker itself had run a year earlier. And I kind of said, whoa, stop. And I called Oliver Sacks, and he said, have you heard of it? He said, well, it's funny you say that, because Peter Brooks I'm in my bathtub, and Peter Brooks just sent it to me, and I'm reading it, and it's really weird. There's whole passages. Oliver Sacks's mother is the 13th of 13 children from the same mother, so there's lots of cousins, and Oliver Sacks's cousins are strewn all over the English landscape, including one who's a major agent who is Brian Friel's agent. So there was a back channel thing, and they asked Brian Friel, did you read this article in the New Yorker? He denied having read any article in the New Yorker. He was absolutely adamant he had not read an article in the New Yorker. Well, it turns out that what happened was that Tina Brown, bless her heart, used to have these soirees with people, and a year earlier, Brian Friel had been in one of her soirees. He'd said he was working on a play about a blind person. She said, oh, wow, I have a manuscript about a blind person. And she gave him the Oliver Sacks typescript without telling Oliver Sacks, but it just gave it to him. And indeed, he had never read the New Yorker piece. But on the other hand, he had such vivid impressions of several of these paragraphs that they just made it completely into the piece. Anyway, that kind of thing happens all the time. Doris Kearns, all that kind of thing. That's usually what's going on. However, then you get over to plagiarism itself, and that keeps different versions. There's forgery, for example, where the reason something looks like something else allegedly is because the person is trying to make you think that. In this case, the famous case of the Dutch artist who was trying to paint Vermeer's. What's fascinating about these kinds of forgeries is that they don't later on look at all like the artist in question. But this is exactly what Vermeer looked like in 1932. So it was able to fool people, but then it ages in a strange sort of way. There's a fascinating story about him, but I won't go into that. Then you get to counterfeiture, where the reason things look like each other is because they're trying to pass it off on you. Either in the form of Gucci's that aren't Gucci's, or famously the form of dollars that look, or $100 bills that look just like $100 bills. So we've gone all the way from Apophenia to counterfeiture, and that is my little natural history. However, there is a coda that I wanted to leave you with. And this is the story of Helen Keller. Helen Keller publishes the story of her life. Helen Keller, blind, deaf from birth. She publishes the story of her life, an unbelievable act of autobiographical excavation. It's a huge bestseller when it comes out in 1903, I think, I'm not sure, 1904. 6 months after it comes out, she is accused of plagiarism. Let me repeat that. Helen Keller is accused of plagiarism. But now think about it for a second. Everything that Helen Keller has ever experienced in her life has been mediated through language. She stands before the Matterhorn, and either she reads the Baedeker guide of what the Matterhorn looks like, or somebody does hands into her hand. She has phenomenal memory, partly because she isn't being bothered by all these sense impressions. She remembers everything, and if she wants to tell you what it was like to stand in front of the Baedeker, in front of the Matterhorn, She tells you exactly what it was like, and it's word for word from the Baedeker. In any case, she falls into a terrible depression. And Mark Twain, bless his heart, writes her a letter. And this letter can be found, you can Google it, if you Google Mark Twain, Helen Keller, plagiarism, but at one point he writes, "Oh, dear me, how unspeakably funny and owlishly idiotic and grotesque was that whole plagiarism farce. As if there was much of anything in any human utterance, oral or written, except plagiarism. The kernel, the soul. Let us go further and say the substance, the bulk, the actual and valuable material of all human utterances is plagiarism. For substantially all ideas are secondhand, consciously or unconsciously drawn from a million outside sources and daily used by the garnerer with a pride and satisfaction born of his superstition that he originated them. Whereas there is not a rag of originality about them anywhere except in the little discoloration they get from his mental and moral caliber and his temperament, which was revealed in characteristics of phrasing." I love that passage. So, now where are we? Let's go back and look at this thing again. Where does that put us? Well, in the case of Fischl, we may be dealing with apophenia, or even leapfrogging apophenia in this case, since I bought into the assertion of this guy, Morris, who showed it to me. It may simply be coincidence, but I suspect it's more than that. It may be conscious allusion on Fischl's part, or else unconscious influence, bad, uncouth men simply wreaking a certain rank, fire-snorting dragonhood all across our culture and other cultures. The nice thing in this instance is that Master Fischl is still around, and we could simply ask him, were he willing to tell us? I once then read this next phrase from the interview, "Master Fischl, are you out there?" And he was. He was there in the audience. And I said, "So what's the deal?" He said, no, he had never thought of this. On the other hand, the nice thing about convergences is that it really doesn't matter whether the artist intended the echo in question consciously or unconsciously. The artist being, as Diderot said, merely the first witness of the completed painting, and in the end capable of claiming no greater status than that. After him there will be further witnesses, all the rest of us equally privileged viewers by virtue of the fact that we all draw equally upon and are equally bathed in the confluence of cross-currents that is the wider cultural surround. Convergence in that sense being nothing less than another name for culture itself. Or as a friend of mine commented to me the other day, she was quoting somebody, she couldn't remember who, she thought it might be Ezra Pound. Culture begins when you forget your sources. Thank you. So, this has gone long. Feel free to leave, but if any of you have questions, I'm happy to answer questions too. Questions or comments? Yeah, go ahead.
You know, are there any examples of convergences in the film world?
Do I have examples of convergences in the film world? Oh, there are. It happens all the time. And there you have a whole phenomenon of people quoting. I mean, just take Breathless, for example. Virtually every shot in Breathless is a quoting of some other film. I've just written a piece about how Vermeer's music lesson, which is badly deconstructed in the film Tim's Vermeer, is in fact beautifully deconstructed in La Jetée, the film by Chris Marker. Filmmakers are constantly quoting each other, and especially now that we have film schools, it happens everywhere. But they're also quoting things in the art world and so forth. So it's absolutely one of the things you see in films all the time. Others? Yeah, over there.
Can you speak a bit about Tim's Vermeer?
Can I speak a little bit about Tim's Vermeer? Do you know what? Tim's Vermeer, there's a film that was recently put out by Tim Gillette about a guy named Tim Jennison by Penn and Teller. And Jennison is this quite inventive, ingenious, enjoyable character. He's an inventor, self-supporting. He invented something early on and has got several $1 million. And he became convinced that Vermeer had to have been using optical devices of a certain kind. He is not the first person to think that. Hockney talks about it. A guy named Philip Stedman has written a whole book on it. And then he proceeds to have a slightly different way of thinking about it, which is actually quite interesting and perhaps entirely plausible. But the film has that kind of Penn and Teller, smart alecky, sophomoric, thumbing their nose at authority, which is kind of the something. And I've just wrote about it. I have a new column in The Believer, the McSweeney's, and it'll be not this. In 2 months, they're going to have their film issue, so my column is about the film, but my general take on the film, which is perfectly fine, and I think Jennison has some valuable points and may even be right. And I'm absolutely sure that Vermeer uses optical devices. There's no doubt about that. But having said that, I found myself kind of in the position of the last page of Portnoy's Complaint, where the shrink says, "Now perhaps we may begin." And whereas the implication from Penn and Teller is, well, it just goes to show that anybody could do it if you had the right equipment and the right amount of gumption. On the contrary, what's so fascinating is how Tim's Vermeer is not a Vermeer. And it gives you a chance to start talking about what is completely amazing about Vermeer, not the least of which is that Vermeer invented cinema. And specifically what you have in Vermeer over and over again are people who are forced to stand still. You have duration. So you have a woman pouring milk. You have a woman looking at the mirror at her pearls. You have a woman having to stand still so that the balances balance. By the way, that's also called weighing gold, but if you look, there's no gold. It's just light on both balances. So you have duration. The duration of lived life. Not only that, but in fact, all of his pictures are slightly out of focus. They're not at all in focus the way that Tim Jennison makes it. And the point about Vermeer that's fascinating is that for the first time you have an artist who is playing with what it looks like to look through optical instruments. The chances are artists have been looking through optical instruments for the 200 years before that. But he's somebody who's fascinated by kind of the halos of light that are things are out of focus, what happens when things are out of focus. That's his subject, which parenthetically is then in why he goes completely out of favor for the next 200 years. And gets discovered, not by chance, in 1845, which is to say shortly after the daguerreotype starts happening. So he has everything wrong for 200 years, and then suddenly he's uncannily right. His things look exactly like the sorts of effects you get in photographs. Now, by the way, there's no way to paint somebody out of focus unless you're using a projection. Because as you look at them, they're in focus. But he was able precisely to paint, and the effect of painting it out of focus was it looked like a memory. It wasn't just that you saw something and time went 1 beat, 2 beats, 3 beats, but it is something that seared itself into you. And it looks like something that you can't get over, which is why the person who really understands Vermeer and who is the filmmaker who really did I would argue, is the film La Jetée, which is like a Vermeer seen through a time mirror. And so that's the argument I make. Yeah.
Yeah, I loved your closing comment about convergence really being another synonym for culture. I'm curious for your comments on convergence also being the mother of invention when it comes to technology. Pun intended, by the way.
But I mean that in turn, I mean I can't talk about it as well as people who are in technology, but there's no question, or phrased differently, and there's entire livelihoods at the law school that are being forged at this very moment for all the plagiarism, lawsuits and so forth and they're just insane. I mean, everybody patents everything, and one of the whole arguments in these patent things, you can't patent that. That's, first of all, you didn't invent it, and secondly, it's all kinds of other things led to it and so forth. There's the very famous line of Newton that, he could only, or no, is it Einstein? Newton could only see so far because he stood on the shoulders of giants. Newton. but Einstein will say the same thing. But it's certainly true in technology that every invention is an amalgam and so forth, and a slight twist of all the other things, which in turn leads to just the whole comedy of intellectual property, which is one of the more. And in fact, I gave a version of this lecture at a conference in intellectual property, and at the same conference, Jonathan Lethem gave a spectacular lecture on plagiarism, at the end of which he announced that every single sentence had been plagiarized for somebody.
Rand, we have time for one more.
Okay, let's see. Two more. These two guys get to ask questions.
Right.
Okay, first.
Obviously, you're performing a kind of heretical act here. And
I should hope so.
I'm looking at your list as a proposed curriculum for the 21st century. Why shouldn't we be teaching the students all of these techniques? Because you're telling us basically this is the culture we swim in. But let's not drown. Let's make the swim a little more, I wouldn't want to say pleasurable. So we'll learn how to plagiarize. We'll learn how to convert. Wonderful.
Well,
would you buy into that?
Well, I would simply say that that's what university is anyway. And this is just a way of being a little bit more. I do have a thing, by the way, which is interesting about the whole argument about whether you should teach creative design in school, intelligent design, I mean. And I feel that it should be absolutely mandatory. You should teach it, but not in a science class and not in a religious class, in an epistemology class. A class about it should be in 8th grade. How do we know what we know? And Darwinians can present how they know what they know, and you absolutely want to have the strongest possible case for intelligent design. And what constitutes evidence, what constitutes an argument, and so forth. I would be all for that. More than for that, I think it really would help everything out. Last question there, and then I'm going to show one last thing also. Go ahead.
Your presentation is going, my question goes in this direction. Is there something that does not converge? And if so, if there is something I can perceive this?
Is there something that does not converge?
And if I can perceive, if there is, I could perceive, I could.
I would argue. I mean, I think you're making a good point. Could you perceive it? And I would suggest that we only see by way of what we've already seen. I had an extraordinary experience. I've written about this in my book Vermeer in Bosnia. I had an experience of the day my daughter was born. You would think that would be somebody who hasn't seen anything ever. And I was holding her 30 seconds after she was born. And her eyes were drilling into my eyes. How do eyes know about eyes? I mean, you would have thought that she would have been looking at my mouth, which was moving insanely, or at my nose, which is pronounced. She was not. She was looking straight into my eyes. And I talked about it with people the next day, and somebody gave the sociobiological reason that the ones who didn't look in the eyes were thrown out. But I began to think that there was something deeply primordial, that as I was looking into her eyes, I was looking deep, deep into the past's past, which of course was backwards. She was looking into the past's past. I was looking into the future's future. But the point is that, to be told by a scientist that the reason she's doing this is because there is a prior predilection for looking at dark pools of blackness, in pairs, doesn't answer anything. I'm asking, why is that? So it's kind of fascinating. So listen, I'll give you one last bonus. This is like the bonus thing you get at the end. Here's a really weird set of. I was just in Australia, and I came upon this painting here, which is a large painting by a group of women, Aboriginal women. It's a dream song, which is to say it is a representation of this place that they all came from, and it's very, very beautiful. This is just in the last 30 years. Aboriginal artists have been given acrylic paints, and now are doing things in acrylics that they used to do in sand and so forth. But what was so amazing to me is how much it looked like this painting by David Hockney. It had exactly the same dimensions. And what's weird about the David Hockney painting is that it is also about geography, about a sense of place. It's called Mulholland Drive. And I always say that Mulholland Drive, in the painting Mulholland Drive, the word drive is a verb. and your eye really goes for a drive. It's about the drive from his studio to his house. But what happens, you can't really see it here, but that's a map of the San Fernando Valley. And when you're coming down this way, you see that there. When you're coming up this way, you see that there. And it's basically exactly the same thing. I don't know why. I mean, I just leave it for you. And then there was another painting by a guy named Jim Jampanaski, which, of course, looks just like Rothko. And I read an article about him, and when somebody showed him a book of Rothko's, he said, that guy paints just like me. But what's interesting about this is that for him, this is, again, a representation of the Alice Springs Mountains, a holy site. Whereas for Rothko, there's a whole thing about Rothko talking about the spiritual quality, the kind of Yahweh, the burning bush, and so forth. These are both representations of kind of holy sites. And so, anyway, it's one last. Can I do one last one, and then you can go? Okay, very, very last one. This is the very last one. In fact, this is the subject of next month's Pillow of Air. That's the title of my piece, my column in the New Yorker, Pillow of Air, and I mean in the Believer. What I get it from is that pillow of air you have lodged in your mouth when something amazing is going on, and the polyphonic spree, as Nick Hornby calls them, the staff there calls it pillow of hot air. Anyway, a friend of mine sent me this picture of the Costa Concordia again being picked up, and he said, "This is driving me crazy. It's obviously," there was a photograph from about a month ago. "It's obviously quoting an Impressionist painting. I just can't figure out which one, and I go online and I can't figure out which one." And so I went online, and of course you get ones that are close. But I couldn't find one, and then I began to think that that's maybe the way things work, is that in fact you make composite things in your head that then feed in. And I was all set to write that and make a fool of myself, because then somebody sent me the Cartier-Bresson photograph. And obviously, the guy who took the photograph is alluding to the Cartier-Bresson thing, right down to the skiff. But just as obviously, Cartier-Bresson, when he came to that decisive moment and realized that was the image of images, he came to that because he had already seen it 100 times in all those other paintings. Anyway, I just knocked myself out here. Sorry. Anyway, end of story. Go home.